This video is sponsored by 40k combat cards. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this would normally be the time slot that's taken over by best armies in 40k, but today we're going to be talking about one army in particular, because the World Championships of Warhammer were just concluded right at the time of recording. I'm going to get this up as quickly as possible to talk about the army that won. The event was won by Folger Piles, who was running Adeptus Custodes. A little bit of an underdog story in terms of factions at the event. A lot of people were expecting wins out of factions like Astra Militarum or the newly revamped Ultramarines. Instead, we saw Adeptus Custodes come from left field, and it was an incredible event to watch. Coverage of the event was provided over by the official Warhammer Twitch channel, as well as alternative language broadcasts in both French at French Wargame, as well as La Voix des Horus. I'll leave links to all of those live streams down in the video description if you want to take a look at the event coverage yourself. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about Folger Piles' route to victory, as well as his list. We're going to talk about what makes this list tick, really dig into it, as well as discuss what his opponents were playing. But before we dive in, it's time to check in with our sponsors. Did you know 40k used to be a card game? And actually, it still is. It's called Warhammer 40k Combat Cards. This is based on the 1980 Citadel combat cards that was a reuse of ancient Citadel miniatures from the dawn of time in a trading card game setting. And for the last 5 years, Warhammer 40k combat cards has sought to bring that old game back to modern audiences on iOS, Android, and on Steam. The current incarnation of Warhammer 40k combat cards uses modern game mechanics as well as updated visuals using modern Games Workshop miniatures painted by the Heavy Metal team. So, not only is it a good way to pass the time, but you can also use it to brush up on your miniature knowledge. So download the game from the links in the video description and enjoy live events, an ever-evolving card range, as well as new features currently being released, such as a Horde mode, Apocalypse mode, and Wild Card unlocks. Big thanks to Warhammer 40k Combat Cards for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you at the card table. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Adeptus Custodes and Folger Piles' list at the World Championships. Now, Adeptus Custodes has sort of constructed itself as a bit of a mono faction, with only one real list archetype that we typically see. And while Folger's list does follow that archetype almost exactly, it is running a bit of a non-standard detachment. First, let's discuss the components of the list. Leading it were 3 Blade Champions, giving their attached units a once per game advance and charge, as well as charge rerolls. The Blade Champions themselves hit relatively hard and also turn on attachment bonuses for units like Custodian Wardens, which is what they were slotting into. Following that up, we had 4 total units of Custodian Infantry, a unit of 4 Custodian Guard, as well as 3 units of 5 Custodian Wardens. As I mentioned before, these Blade Champions were attaching into those Custodian Warden squads. That would give the Wardens their -1 to be wounded for attacks with a strength higher than their toughness characteristic, meaning that the unit was resilient to high impact attacks, even in the best case scenario being only able to be wounded on 3s. The Wardens also have a pretty decent number of high value attacks that the Blade Champions can commit into the fight with their advance and charge. This is a fairly common combination, and 2 or 3 of these units is common in almost every Custodian build. From that, we had the ubiquitous Custodian Guard Squad. These 4 Custodian Guardsmen were attached in with Inquisitor Kyria Draxus. Draxus has a ton of synergy with the Custodians themselves. As long as they are touching an objective marker, the entire unit gets wound rerolls on all their attacks, both ranged and melee. And since Kyria Draxus throws a total of 10 2-damage attacks at a relatively mid to low strength, her getting those wound rerolls is able to synergize expertly. Since her Dirge Singer also has devastating wounds, that gives you more opportunities to trigger devastating wounds as well. The Custodian Guard's once per game ability allows them to fire their weapons an additional time, which allows Kyria Draxus to fire her 10 attacks a second time, giving the unit somewhere around 22 doubled to 44 2-damage shots if they're all able to target a single enemy. Supporting that shooting was some backline shooting from a pair of Custodes grav tanks. These were equipped with Arachnus heavy blaze cannon, which is the standard weapon selection for the tank since the beginning of the edition. The damage output of the blaze cannon is phenomenal, especially for the Custodes' relatively reasonable points cost, speed, and survivability, especially against heavy targets and engaging in a gunfight at long range, something that the Custodians themselves really don't want to be dealing with. The Custodes grav tank absolutely shine, with their weapons exhibiting a ridiculous amount of reliability, with a 2+ ballistic skill, wound rerolls, as well as lethal hits when targeting monsters or vehicles. Now, backing that up was a ton of utility. This included an Anathema Psychana Rhino to embark some combination of the 4 Prosecutors and 8 Witch Seekers that were also included in the list. Now, the Witch Seekers offer you a lot of potential utility. They can force battle shock checks on enemies, have a Flamer, which is nice, and also have Scout, which they can contribute to the Rhino they're embarked in. Now, the real benefit here is their synergy with the army's detachment. This is not the shield host that we would often expect to see from Adeptus Custodes, but a Talons of the Emperor. Now, we have talked about Talons of the Emperor on the channel in the past, and the amount of utility that this detachment is able to bring to a Custodes army. Whereas a detachment like Shield Host has higher potential damage, they don't have as many useful effects as Talons of the Emperor tends to do. The detachment rule from this detachment is fairly unique. It allows the Anathema Psychana units and the Custodian units to benefit each other with some of their stats and special rules while within 6 inches of each other. All of your Anathema Psychana units broadcast a 5+ feel no pain against psychic attacks and mortal wounds to the Custodes within 6 inches of them, while Custodes units broadcast +1 to hit to Anathema Psychana units within 6 inches of them. For the most part, the defensive buff from the Anathema Psychana onto the Custodian Guard is the more important half of this partnership, and especially in matchups such as Thousand Suns, where lots of psychic attacks are getting thrown around, being able to use that Rhino or those fast Witch Seeker squads to follow up with the Custodian Wardens or the Custodian Guards and protect them from that incoming damage is huge, especially since those Anathema Psychana have a 3+ feel no pain baked in against psychic attacks themselves, meaning that if your opponent doesn't have traditional shooting to deal with them, they're going to be very tough to kill. Now, we didn't take any of the enhancements from the detachment, but the army does make great use of all of its stratagems. Now, all of the Talons of the Emperor stratagems allow you to target up to 2 units, as long as one of them is Anathema Psychana and one of them is a classic Custodian. However, that is not a requirement of the stratagems. You can just simply target a single Custodian unit with that stratagem if you want to, but they have additional utility if you are playing your Psychana and your Custodian Guards together. This includes a pair of stratagems which make it much easier for you to skirmish with your opponent, including Hunt as 1, which is a 1 CP fallback, shoot, and charge, meaning that your Custodian Warden squads can pop their Feel No Pains for a turn, soak a bunch of damage, get engaged in melee, and still fall back and operate normally. On the flip side, we also have Taloned Pincer, which allows 1 Custodian Guards unit, or up to 2 units if one of them is Anathema Psychana, to reactive move 6 inches when an enemy unit moves within 9 of them. These 2 stratagems together make these Custodian Guard that are bullying the middle of the table much more difficult to pin down than you would expect out of most Custodes lists. Whereas in some detachments, it is possible to lock Custodes into melee, and well, for most armies, it's not really where you want to be. This allows additional flexibility to Custodian Guards that are engaged in melee and then are able to fall back through the enemy or around them to now charge and engage new units. Taloned Pincer can allow you to sandpaper away enemy squads, then move 6 inches away, or even move 6 inches aggressively forward to flip objective control on objectives or move behind cover. In the hands of a good player, like Folger Piles, a detachment with abilities like this is incredibly flexible, which is the reason that it was chosen. We also have some very useful additional synergies, including Talons Interlocked, a 1 CP stratagem that gives you +1 strength and AP to an infantry squad. This is incredibly strong on that Custodian Guard squad with Kyria Draxus, giving her all of the benefits of the stratagem and affecting that unit for the entire phase. So if the Custodes use it on the 1 turn that they double shoot out of the game, their weapons are going to get that bonus for all 44 of those aforementioned attacks. On top of that, once you get stuck into melee, and especially once those enemy units start taking damage from that Custodian Guard squad and the backline Custodes grav tanks, you can use Emperor's Executioners to get +1 to to wound if you target enemies that are below starting strength. Now, the flexibility of this detachment and this list, I think, is paramount when discussing Folger Pyle's win. It seemed that in many instances, he was on the back foot, at least attritionally, for a large part of the game. However, given the fact that Adeptus Custodes tend to be high OC, with a base OC2 on basically their whole army, and bonus OC from the Vexilla in their Custodian Guard squads, when using stratagems like Hunt is One and Taloned Pincer to move around the table, you can keep yourself live on scenario, even while losing models. On top of that, the resilience of the Custodian Wardens, with -1 to be wounded, a 4+ feel no pain once per game, as well as a spike of additional threat range with that attached Blade Champion, was incredibly impactful for getting them into the fight and on those objectives in order to play for those points. It seemed like most of Folger's games were incredibly scrappy, and they came down to the minutia of positioning and using those aforementioned flexibility stratagems to the best of their ability. Last but certainly not least, you also have the incredible shooting from those Caladius grav tanks, some of the best anti-tank firepower in the entire game, which were able to tear through a lot of vehicles in several matchups, especially since it was difficult to target them with anti-vehicle shooting because a lot of that shooting had to go into the wardens that were threatening to beat down your front door. Now with that, let's talk about the factions that Folger played on his route to the World Championship. In round 1, he was paired with Dino Sori from Andorra. I hope that's a real name, because if it is, great. Where he was able to secure a solid 88 to 42 point win against Grey Knights. I have to imagine that the anti-psychic defense that units like those Anathema Psychona were able to add helps a lot in matchups like these, especially since Dino was running 3 Brotherhood Librarians as well as several Nemesis Dread Knights and had a ton of psychic shooting. In round 2, he was paired against Kyle Grundy and his Retaliation Cadre. This is a fascinating matchup, and I kind of wish that I had been able to watch this one because Kyle was running an extremely battlesuit heavy variety of Retaliation Cadre that we've seen players like Jack Harpster playing more recently. This included 3 Cold Star commanders, 3 Enforcer commanders, as well as a ton of Sunforged battlesuit teams. 3 Sunforged battlesuit teams in total, and a bunch of Star Scythe teams. While there was a Fire Knife battlesuit team with plasma rifles, unfortunately, the Custodes kind of dodge a lot of the offensive power that the Star Scythes and Sunforges bring. They're not monsters or vehicles, so the Sunforges don't benefit from their built-in rerolls against those unit types, and the Star Scythes, while they can be high AP and high volume, they don't have the best profile matchup into things like Custodian Wardens, especially because they have to engage right next to them in order to have a chance to kill them, thanks to the Retaliation Cadre's close-range shooting abilities. However, if they fail to kill any Custodes at all, the Custodes are going to come back and hit them directly in the face. That ended up being a fairly decisive 90 to 61 point win for Folger. In round 3, Folger was paired against Spain's Borja, who was running Blood Angels. This is not like an incredible game. Apparently, Borja had been able to get up in secondary points, but blanked out towards the end of the game, and Folger was able to dig into the deck to pull the cards he exactly needed and tie his opponent 82 to 82.
We streamed his game against Borja of Spain, who is one of the best players in Spain, naturally got a golden ticket, one of the best players, and it was Blood Angels versus Custodes. This game, on the last turn, Borja had probably about 1,200 points of his army left, and I think Folger had 5 models. Borja had to pull 5 or more points on his last 2 secondary cards to ice the game. He pulled a 2-pointer and a 2-pointer. I believe he even cycled and pulled another 2-pointer. Could not score 5 points. You need to score 6, I believe, to put it out of reach. So, okay, he's up by 11 points exactly going into the bottom of turn. But we're taking into account that both players are getting 15 points. Folger needs to pull a 5-point secondary and exactly containment. He needs to pull exactly those 2, and with 5 models, score both. He pulls Secure No Man's Land and Containment, and he ties the game, gets 11 points on secondaries.
That saw Folger paired into Nick Blackburn from Canada in round 4. Nick was playing Leagues of Votann and went down 53 to 90. and moved Folger on to a ridiculously close game in round 5 against Kit Smith, winning 57-51 against Hypercrypt Legion Necrons. Kit was playing the now fairly popular thick variety of Hypercrypt Legion, including 2 Doomsday Arcs, 2 Monoliths, and support units to them. However, this is a relatively low volume of shooting that I could see struggle with the Custodes if they're able to spike their saves, giving those Custodians the opportunity to hold down objectives for a long enough period of time that they're able to squeak out that win against the much more maneuverable Necrons. And that after a shadow round in which Folger apparently played against Borgia again and was able to squeak out an extremely close win a second time, he was up against Stefan Meertens from the Netherlands. This game was streamed over on the official Warhammer Twitch channel, and Stefan was running a Wolf Jail variety of Stormlance Space Wolves. This list seeks to put so many Thunderwolf cavalry in your face with defensive buffs and ridiculous speed that you're never able to climb back into the game on primary. However, Custodes are uniquely suited to deal with them. A relatively high strength, high volume 2 damage melee attack with a solid AP value is literally exactly what you need to kill Thunderwolf cavalry, and that is what Custodes armies have in spades. While this game ended up being very close and Folger did end up going down to a very low model count, with Stefan with almost an entire Thunderwolf cavalry unit as well as several Gladiator Lancers remaining at the end of the game, he was able to keep parity on primary despite the aggressive play from the Space Wolves. The Custodian Guard's ability to knock out the Thunderwolf cavalry very quickly meant that they couldn't necessarily keep the Custodes contained in their deployment zone, and a better score on secondary draws, especially thanks to those Anathema Psychona units consistently scoring, meant that Folger won that game by 2 points. And that put Folger into the semi-finals of the event, where he was paired against Jesper Unander Sharin from Sweden. This game was streamed over on the French Wargame channel. Jesper was bringing an Ironstorm Spearhead variety of Ultramarines, complete with Marnius Calgar and Robute Gilliman, backed up by a ton of Vindicators and Ballistus Dreadnoughts. The downside is that this variety of list is relatively light on the ground, at least in the center of the table. While it does have these big vehicles, if they're not able to punch through Custodian Guardsmen, they're going to be knocked down very quickly in melee, and the only real counterpunch that the list was bringing were those 2 aforementioned characters. In this game, Folger was able to get second turn and stage his army fairly effectively to push towards the center of the table. This forced Jesper to push his characters far forward, seeing him lose them early on in the game, although at the cost of many Custodian Guards. Unfortunately, the tanks in the center of the table were not able to out-OC those Custodian Guardsmen as the game moved on, and moving into battle rounds 4 and 5, Folger was able to pull out a lead on primary objective scoring. He was also able to get bottom of game scoring on top of that for a decisive 89-55 win. That put him into the finals with John Lennon, the runner-up of last year's World Championships of Warhammer that we talked about on this channel extensively. John was playing a fairly standard variety of Astra Militarum, utilizing a combination of tanks like tank commanders, hydras, and infantry like Catachan Jungle Fighters, Halden Chimeras, and Tempestus Aquilons. Now, it should be noted that the event was using a depowered version of Tempestus Aquilons with a slightly reworked wording of precision drop, which I talked about in a video last week. Even with this minor handicap and a roll to go first, John was able to run up the score in the early game, pushing his army into a position where he could threaten 2 of the 3 center objectives fairly consistently with transports with embarked units. Recognizing the danger of this early game lead, Folger pushed his Blade Champions and their attached Custodian Warden squads directly into the center of the table. One of them staged for a follow-up attack, whereas 2 of them popped their advance and charge early to knock out 2 transports with their units embarked and pinned those guardsmen into melee. This was a huge extension and could have gone disastrously if Folger didn't make a reasonable number of relatively tough charges with those built-in rerolls from the Blade Champions datasheet ability ability. This put John into a make or break position. He had to clear enough of the Custodian Wardens early enough that he could then push his army to victory. So he had to make a big push on round 2. This caused Folger to pop all 3 of the 4+ Feel No Pains in John's round 2 shooting phase. And unfortunately for the Astra Militarum, it didn't go their way. The Custodians were able to make enough invulnerable saves, 4+ Feel No Pains, and force enough of John's attacks to fail with that wound bonus that they just barely survived through his shooting, and were then able to push forward, kill several infantry squads without them being able to reinforce, since John was low on CP at that point, as well as engage multiple tanks. While over the course of the remainder of the game, John was able to knock down most of the Custodian infantry. At that time, the Caladius Grav tanks had engaged and started pulling those tank commanders and other support vehicles off the table very quickly, leaving John essentially tabled by battle round 4, and leaving Folger Piles as the winner of the event. The finals game was covered both on La Voz de Horus, alongside an English commentary from Adam Camilleri and Paul Murphy on the main Warhammer stream. I highly recommend you take a peek at this game because some of the positioning in it was incredibly cool. And the cool thing about it was that we were able to get multiple simultaneous camera angles because of the multiple streamers covering it at the same time, which was pretty fun to watch. But that put a relative underdog faction with a fairly unexpected detachment into the top placing in the World Championships of Warhammer 2024, and cemented Folger Piles as our 2024 Warhammer 40k champion. Huge congratulations to him for showcasing such impressive play with Custodes throughout the entirety of the event, and it definitely seemed that in order to be consistently successful with Adeptus Custodes, you had to have a very good grasp of risk management, as well as the capacity to use your high OC units and your reactive stratagems to keep them in operation and keep them denying victory points from your opponent throughout the entire game. It seemed like many of Folger's games, he was left with only a couple models, but he was able to use those models to the best of their ability to flip the score in his favor, and that's what put him ahead over the competition. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about this list and what you think about the results of the World Championships of Warhammer for this year. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Not to mention Warhammer 40k Combat Cards for sponsoring this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.